Imagine an empire so influential, so strategically brilliant, that it controlled vast swathes of the Mediterranean, yet today, its name barely registers in mainstream history. Welcome to my channel Words of Time, and prepare to uncover the astonishing legacy of the Kingdom of Aragon, the lost empire that built the foundations of modern Spain and left an indelible mark on the world. The idea behind the shadow of the Iberian Peninsula rests on the way one kingdom came to stand in for an entire region, even though the land we think of as a single country was once a collection of very different realms. When people think about the history of the area today, they often picture one dominant power shaping events on land and sea. Yet there was a time when another kingdom held great influence, carried its own voice, and pursued its own course across the Mediterranean. It is this earlier presence that helps explain why the region's story is more complex than it appears on the surface. Long before the lands we now associate with a single national identity began to merge, the northeastern part of the peninsula grew into a political and cultural force with its own pace and character. This kingdom was Aragon. It is easy for many to forget that Aragon was not simply a supporting piece of the region's later unity. It was a center of authority with its own institutions, languages, and vision. When later histories blur these distinctions, they lose sight of how the peninsula once held several rival courts, each with its own priorities, strengths, and weaknesses. Aragon's rise came from geography and trade. Its land stretched from the Pyrenees downward, creating a corridor that linked the inland valleys with the Mediterranean shore. That coast became the heart of a maritime economy. Ports like Barcelona turned into busy trading points where merchants brought goods from across the sea. Aragon's rulers recognized this strength and used it to widen their reach. They built fleets, pursued alliances, and sent expeditions beyond their own waters. Over time, Aragon came to influence islands and coastal cities far from the peninsula itself. This maritime reach was not accidental. Aragon's leaders understood that influence often depended on command of the sea. Their approach was different from the dominant inland kingdom of Castile, which focused on expansion across plateaus, valleys, and rivers. Castile's priorities lay in agriculture, frontier settlements, and internal consolidation. Aragon's priorities leaned toward commerce, ports, and naval power. These contrasting directions shaped two distinct political cultures. One grew around seafaring wealth, the other around land-based strength. The difference extended into law and governance. Aragon developed a system in which local rights and regional traditions held significant weight. Institutions such as the Cortes gave the nobility and towns a structured voice. It was not a modern democracy, but it did create checks on the ruler's power. This led to a political climate in which negotiation mattered. Castile, by contrast, tended toward greater royal authority and a stronger central hold over its territories. When later writers compress these histories together, they overlook how Aragon's political style set it apart. Cultural life also marked Aragon as distinct. The languages spoken there, influenced by contact with neighboring regions and Mediterranean trade, carried signs of its position between worlds. Art, literature, and custom reflected a mixture of inland and coastal identities. The kingdom was both a bridge and a frontier. Its people had roots in the peninsula, but their eyes were fixed on the wider sea. The resulting culture was neither wholly local nor wholly foreign. It grew from the flow of ships, goods, and ideas that landed on Aragonese shores. Aragon's expansion into Mediterranean territories deepened this outward identity. Over generations, its rulers gained influence over islands like Majorca and lands such as Sardinia and Sicily. These were not minor holdings. They placed Aragon at the center of a network of ports stretching across the sea. The fleets that carried soldiers and administrators also carried merchants, languages, and customs. Aragon became a maritime confederation in everything but name. Its rulers governed not just land, but sea routes and strategic islands that shaped regional power. This naval strength allowed Aragon to challenge rivals beyond the peninsula. In the central and eastern Mediterranean, it contended with powers that were far older and better known. Its presence forced other kingdoms to respond, either through alliances or through confrontation. Although later ages would remember the grand fleets of later unified Spain, many of the practices that made those fleets possible began in the ports of Aragonese territory. The union between Aragon and Castile eventually changed the balance. When the two crowns joined through marriage, their separate identities did not vanish overnight. Instead, They continued to operate under different laws and traditions for many years. Yet outside observers began to treat them as a single force. That shift in perception helped erase the earlier distinctions in popular memory. Castile's inland strength and territorial drive came to overshadow Aragon's maritime presence. Over time, many assumed that the story of the peninsula had always been a story of Castile. In truth, it had once been several stories woven together. This merging of narratives has consequences for how we understand later events. When people think of early ventures across the Atlantic, they often associate them with Castile. Yet the ability to organize large fleets, maintain supply lines, and handle distant possessions had strong roots in Aragon's earlier experience. Its maritime tradition contributed knowledge and structure that shaped later undertakings. These influences were not always acknowledged, but they formed a foundation for what followed. Even within the peninsula, Aragon retained a distinct character long after the crowns joined. Its political institutions continued to function, its laws remained separate, and its cultural identity persisted. There were tensions, compromises, and disagreements. These moments reveal how complex the process of unification truly was. It was not a simple blending into a smooth whole. It was a long negotiation between older identities that had grown in separate environments. The decline of Aragon's independent role came gradually. As the unified monarchy directed its attention toward wider ambitions, Castile's larger population and resources gave it more influence in decision-making. Maritime priorities took second place to the needs of empire across the Atlantic. The ports of the Mediterranean lost the status they once held. Their traditions did not disappear, but they became part of a larger framework in which inland concerns often dominated. This shift completed the process by which Aragon faded from many historical accounts as a separate power. Yet understanding Aragon is essential for anyone seeking a clear picture of the region's past. Without it, the story becomes too narrow and too simple. The idea of a single kingdom shaping the destiny of the peninsula does not match the reality of earlier centuries. Instead, there were multiple kingdoms, each pulling in its own direction. Aragon pulled toward the sea, commerce, and Mediterranean influence. Its choices shaped trade, diplomacy, warfare, and culture in ways that later histories often overlook. The kingdom's contributions can be seen in the development of maritime law, port management, and the organization of naval forces. They can be traced in architecture, language, and the cultural life of coastal cities. They echoed in the way later rulers approached the governance of distant territories. Even though the political union changed the role of Aragon, the earlier patterns did not vanish. They continued to influence how the region related to the sea and to the wider world. A closer look reveals how Aragon's early expansion built connections that lasted for generations. Merchants from its ports traded with cities from Italy to North Africa. Sailors carried goods and stories back and forth. These exchanges shaped local customs and helped build an understanding of distant cultures. This exposure gave Aragon a broader outlook than might be expected from a kingdom of its size. Its people learned to navigate not only waters, but also the complexities of Mediterranean politics. The story of Aragon also highlights the importance of balance between land and sea power. Regions that focus solely on inland expansion risk losing access to major trade routes. Regions that focus solely on maritime strength risk losing secure agricultural bases. Aragon managed to combine both, but it leaned more heavily toward the sea. This choice defined its character and set it apart from surrounding realms. The contrast helps explain why the later union created both unity and friction. Each side brought a different strategic approach, shaped by centuries of experience. When we consider how histories are told, it becomes clear that some stories rise while others fall into the background. Aragon's decline in public memory reflects this pattern. Once it was a major force, shaping events from the Pyrenees to Sicily. Now it is often mentioned only in passing, as though it were a minor province rather than a powerful kingdom. This loss of visibility does not reflect its true role. Instead, it shows how later political realities can shape the way earlier events are remembered. Recovering the memory of Aragon does not mean elevating it above other kingdoms. It means acknowledging the diverse roots that formed the region as we know it today. It means recognizing that a long maritime tradition once stood at the heart of the peninsula's influence. It means seeing the region not as a single land, but as a mosaic shaped by trade routes, mountain barriers, alliances, and rivalries. By looking back at Aragon's earlier independence, we find a richer sense of how the peninsula functioned. We see a kingdom that developed institutions suited to its environment, pursued its goals through negotiation, and projected its influence across the sea. We see a culture shaped by ports and ships rather than by plains and plateaus. We see a political style that valued compromise more than central force. These traits matter because they help explain the later dynamics within the unified monarchy. They also change the way we understand the broader Mediterranean. Aragon was not a passive coastline. It was a participant in the region's shifting power struggles. Its ships fought, traded, and negotiated from one shore to another. Its rulers balanced alliances with ambition. This activity helped shape the political map of the sea long before the later empire took center stage. The question that often surprises readers is how such a kingdom could fade from memory. The answer lies partly in scale. Castile grew larger and more populous. When the center of gravity shifted toward the Atlantic, the Mediterranean lost influence. The older powers of the sea gave way to new transoceanic ambitions. Aragon's earlier importance became less relevant to the concerns of later rulers, and so it gradually slipped into the background. Yet if we step back, we can see that Aragon set precedents for maritime organizations, administrative structures, and trade networks that continued to shape the region long after its political weight declined. The knowledge gained through centuries of sea-based expansion did not disappear. It fed into the broader skill set of the unified kingdom. The foundations laid in earlier centuries helped support later ventures, even if the people of those later times did not always realize where the ideas had come from. Remembering Aragon's role does more than fill a gap in historical knowledge. It changes the way we interpret the entire development of the peninsula. It shifts our attention from a single inland narrative to a more varied picture. It invites us to see the region as a meeting point of cultures, influenced as much by waves and ships as by plains and fortresses. It reminds us that identity is not fixed, but formed through centuries of choice, contact, and adaptation. In this broader view, Aragon becomes more than a forgotten kingdom. It becomes a key to understanding how the region first learned to look beyond its own shores. When later generations built fleets that carried them across oceans, they drew on a tradition that began much earlier. Many assume that the story of seafaring dominance started with one unified power, but the roots lie deeper, in a time when a smaller kingdom carved its place through the waters of the Mediterranean. The rise of the northeastern realms of the peninsula did not end with the maritime legacy that shaped their early identity. The next stage in their story built on that foundation and produced a force that stretched far beyond its modest beginnings. This shift started when the ruling houses of the inland valleys and the coastal counties created a shared crown. What followed was not a simple blending of two regions. It was the creation of a layered political structure that could project power across wide distances. The earlier experience with ports and maritime networks now met the resources and traditions of inland territories, forming a union that moved with greater confidence across the Mediterranean. This union joined the customs of mountain lands with the commercial strength of coastal cities. The result was a system that allowed a single crown to rule distinct territories without forcing them into a single model. Each region kept its own laws, its own institutions, and its own economic rhythm. Instead of weakening the crown, this variety gave it flexibility. Merchants could work through ports that handled traffic to and from North Africa and the Central Sea. Farmers and herders from the inland areas supplied grain, wool, and livestock that encouraged further trade. Rulers could draw on soldiers who grew up in rugged terrain, as well as sailors who understood long sea journeys. This variety helped the crown expand at a pace that surprised older powers. The expansion did not happen in a sudden burst. It grew through a series of campaigns, treaties, inheritances, and calculated risks. The islands and coastal lands that came under its control were not chosen at random. They lay along vital trade routes or held strategic points where ships sought shelter or passed close to hostile shores. Taking these sites gave the crown both income and influence. Once ports came under its rule, nearby lands tended to follow. Over time, entire regions shifted into its orbit. The island of Sicily became the first major foothold. Its people had lived under several powers and had seen one foreign army after another. When the crown established control there, it gained a position from which to shape the central Mediterranean. Sicily offered fertile land, strong fortifications, and harbors that could host fleets during long campaigns. From there, the crown could respond quickly to threats from rival states. Its ships could move north toward Italian waters or south toward North Africa. This flexibility strengthened the crown's reputation at sea. The next great prize was the Kingdom of Naples. Control over this region brought access to wealthy cities, productive farmland, and a long coastline. Naples linked maritime strength with influence over the Italian mainland. Rival powers struggled to match the speed at which the crown could send troops or supplies. Its commanders often combined negotiation with force, knowing that many cities preferred a ruler who respected local privileges. This method allowed the crown to maintain its gains without endless conflict. It also increased its prestige among the aristocracy of Europe, who now regarded its rulers as major players in regional politics. Sardinia followed as another key step in the expansion. This large island had a rugged landscape and a long history of internal divisions. Securing control required patience, alliances, and repeated campaigns. Once the crown established authority there, it gained another anchor point between the western and central Mediterranean. Sardinia served as both a stopover for fleets and a source of grain and other resources. Its position helped protect the maritime routes that connected the northeastern peninsula with southern Italy and beyond. The most surprising extension of the crown's reach came further east. A series of events involving rival claimants and mercenary forces created an opening in Greece. The result was the establishment of rule over Athens. This was not a simple conquest driven by ambition alone. It grew out of the movements of military companies who had fought for various employers and later carved out territories of their own. When the crown stepped into this web of alliances and conflicts, it took responsibility for a land far removed from its home shores. Control over Athens allowed it to influence the eastern Mediterranean, a region where old empires and new commercial powers competed for ports, trade, and prestige. The ability to maintain lands so far apart was not accidental. It depended on a tradition of maritime organization, long-term planning, and a force that carried both fear and respect throughout the sea. Among these forces, the Almogavers stood out. They were not typical soldiers. They grew up in harsh mountain lands where survival required skill, speed, and toughness. When they entered the service of the crown, they brought a kind of warfare that caught many enemies off guard. They moved quickly, fought with fierce courage, and often worked in small groups that needed little support. Their reputation spread through the Mediterranean, and rulers learned to think carefully before opposing them. These fighters played an important role in campaigns that shaped the crown's influence. They took part in battles on islands, in coastal towns, and on foreign shores. Their ability to endure hardship and strike with precision often gave commanders an advantage. At times, their loyalty shifted when they felt mistreated or unpaid, but when properly led, they were one of the most effective forces of the age. Their actions left a mark on Sicily, Naples, and the eastern Mediterranean. Without them, the expansion of the crown would have been slower and far more uncertain. Their presence also influenced the culture of the lands they entered. Local populations witnessed a style of fighting that differed from the heavy cavalry and formal armies of many European states. The Almogavers relied on agility, close combat, and quick strikes. Their stories became part of the lore of the crown's military tradition. While later generations sometimes softened or exaggerated the accounts, the core of their legacy remained the same. They had helped a kingdom of modest size build an empire that could stand beside much larger states. As the crown extended its reach, its rulers had to manage territories with different languages, legal traditions, and social structures. This challenge shaped the political culture of the Union. The rulers learned that force alone was not enough. They had to negotiate agreements that respected local customs. They had to appoint governors who understood both the needs of the crown and the concerns of local elites. They had to maintain fleets large enough to protect distant ports and transport troops when unrest broke out. These layers of responsibility strengthened the administrative skills of the crown and helped it develop a reputation for stable government. The lands under its rule formed a network rather than a single centralized block. Goods moved between these lands in both directions. Grain, wool, and metalwork traveled from the peninsula to the islands. Spices, fabrics, and luxury goods from the eastern sea flowed back to the ports. Merchants established networks that connected markets from Barcelona to Palermo and from Sardinia to Athens. This created a shared commercial space where ideas, languages, and customs mixed. It also made the crown wealthier and more resilient. The Union also shaped cultural life. The contact between diverse regions introduced new artistic styles, literary influences, and architectural forms. Courts across the crown displayed works that reflected exchanges with Italy, Greece, and North Africa. Poets and thinkers traveled through these lands, learning languages and borrowing traditions. The maritime outlook continued to influence daily life, but it now blended with new experiences gained from faraway territories. This mixture strengthened the identity of the crown as a power that looked outward rather than isolating itself within the peninsula. The crown's naval strength continued to play a decisive role throughout this period. Fleets patrolled waters that stretched from the Balearic Islands to the shores of Greece. These ships were both a military tool and a commercial asset. They protected merchants from pirates and hostile states. They transported soldiers for campaigns in foreign lands. They carried emissaries who negotiated alliances, marriage agreements, and trade privileges. Control of the sea allowed the crown to respond quickly to threats and opportunities. This agility helped maintain its influence even when rival states attempted to challenge its position. Yet expansion also brought strain. Maintaining distant territories required resources, disciplined administration, and constant vigilance. There were times when rival powers gained ground, or when local uprisings forced difficult decisions. The crown had to adjust its strategies, shift alliances, and sometimes rely heavily on the skills of mercenary companies. The effort to keep control over Athens, for example, exposed the limits of ruling faraway lands with different histories. Even so, the crown managed to preserve a broad network of influence for a long period. The endurance of this empire shaped the internal identity of the crown. Its people no longer saw themselves as confined to the boundaries of the peninsula. They grew accustomed to hearing news from Sicily, Naples, or Athens as if these places were part of a shared world. They served in fleets that traveled through waters unfamiliar to earlier generations. They traded goods that came from distant cultures. This widened horizon made the crown more flexible and more aware of the forces that shaped the Mediterranean. The memory of these achievements influenced later generations even after the region began to shift toward new political realities. The marriage that linked the northeastern crown with the inland kingdom created a new political structure, yet the traditions of maritime expansion did not vanish. They remained part of the experience that the Union drew upon as it developed into an even larger power. The earlier expansion into Sicily and Naples prepared the new Union for later challenges in Italy. The skills learned from ruling Sardinia and Athens helped shape administrative methods for distant possessions. Even as the inland kingdom gained greater influence within the Union, the older maritime legacy did not disappear. It became part of the shared heritage, even though its origins lay in a single crown that once stood independent. Later generations who built fleets to cross the Atlantic relied on knowledge that had been refined during campaigns in the Mediterranean. The sense of confidence that allowed sailors to explore unknown waters grew from centuries of experience navigating well-known routes between islands and distant coasts. Looking back at this period helps explain how a modest union could become a Mediterranean powerhouse. The crowns that came together did not merge into a simple whole. They combined their strengths while keeping their internal differences. The coastal traditions of trade and seafaring met the inland traditions of governance and resource management. The result was a flexible structure that could adapt to diverse challenges. This structure allowed the crown to extend its reach even when facing rivals with larger populations or stronger economies. The path from the Pyrenees to the heights of Mediterranean influence was shaped by both opportunity and design. Geography played a role, but so did the willingness of rulers to invest in fleets, negotiate alliances, and rely on soldiers who could navigate rugged lands or turbulent seas. The Almogavers contributed to this effort through sheer prowess and endurance. Their presence gave the crown an edge in battles that determined whether campaigns succeeded or failed. The empire that grew from this combination of forces did not last forever, but its legacy remained long after its political structure changed. The experience of ruling distant territories shaped the administrative habits of later rulers. The contacts built through trade and diplomacy expanded the cultural space of the peninsula. The maritime tradition influenced how the region approached the wider world, both before and after the union with the inland kingdom. This long arc connects directly with the earlier story of a kingdom that built its identity on maritime strength and political negotiation. The union that followed did not erase that identity. It expanded it, combining multiple traditions into a single crown that could project power much farther than any of its parts could have managed alone. Through this connection, the earlier legacy continued to shape events, guiding the region on a path that would lead to new horizons and new challenges. The story of the northeastern crown's rise across the Mediterranean set the stage for a political and cultural world that differed from anything found in the inland kingdom with which it later merged. The union that shaped its seafaring empire did not rely on central command alone. Its strength grew from a structure that balanced authority, negotiation, and local rights. That balance helped the crown maintain influence across a wide territory, from islands to coastal lands scattered through the sea. As its reach expanded, its political habits, its legal innovations, and its cultural exchanges created a distinctive system that would leave a lasting mark on the regions it touched. The political structure of this realm emerged from a long tradition in which power rested not only with rulers, but also with institutions that represented the interests of nobles, towns, and clergy. These assemblies were not empty gatherings created to flatter the crown. They were working bodies with the authority to grant taxes, approve policies, and protect local rights. The ruler needed their consent to move forward with major plans. This created an environment in which negotiation became a constant part of governance. Instead of issuing commands and expecting instant obedience, the ruler had to listen, persuade, compromise, and justify. This practice shaped the political character of the crown in ways that influenced its expansion and its daily administration. Local charters also played a major role. Many towns held written rights that guaranteed certain freedoms, customs, and legal protections. These documents limited the crown's ability to impose sudden changes. They also encouraged the growth of self-governing communities in which merchants, urban elites, and craft guilds participated in decision-making. These communities became vital partners in the crown's maritime economy. Their ability to manage ports, regulate trade, and maintain stable markets allowed the crown to fund its campaigns and administer distant holdings. The political structure thus operated from the bottom up as much as from the top down. It supported a lively civic life in which citizens understood their role and defended it vigorously. This balance between authority and local rights helped the crown rule territories far beyond its home soil. When it absorbed islands or coastal cities, it often confirmed existing privileges instead of replacing them. This approach gained the loyalty of local elites, who preferred a ruler that respected their customs. It also gave the crown access to experienced administrators familiar with the region. The ability to adapt to local law and tradition made the crown more flexible than many of its rivals. This political culture eased the challenge of governing Sicily, Naples, Sardinia, and Athens, where diverse languages, histories, and customs required careful handling. The growth of maritime influence also encouraged the creation of legal tools that regulated trade, navigation, and conflict at sea. In the bustling ports of the northeastern coast, merchants needed a way to resolve disputes quickly. They needed clear rules for contracts, shipping, cargo damage, and cooperation among crews from different lands. To meet these needs, scholars and experienced traders compiled a body of maritime customs that reflected centuries of practice. This work resulted in a written code that transformed the way the Mediterranean conducted business. This code, known in the local language as the Book of the Sea Consulate, represented one of the most ambitious legal projects of the medieval world. It brought together rules that shaped nearly every aspect of maritime life. It explained how to settle commercial disagreements, handle navigation errors, resolve shipwreck claims, divide profits, assign responsibility in cases of piracy, and govern joint ventures. It offered standards for hiring crews, organizing convoys, responding to emergencies, and judging the actions of captains. Because these rules came from actual practice, they felt familiar to merchants and sailors across the sea. They were clear, practical, and grounded in the experience of countless voyages. The influence of this code spread rapidly. Ports that had never been part of the crown's domains adopted its standards because it simplified trade and reduced confusion. Judges used it to settle disputes between people from different regions. Merchants relied on it to plan their ventures with confidence that the law would protect their agreements. Over time, the code spread far beyond the Mediterranean, shaping maritime law in other regions and influencing later generations of jurists. It became one of the crown's most enduring contributions to the world of commerce. The code's existence also reflected the political habits of the crown. It grew from a society that valued negotiation, written rights, and the rule of law. Just as parliaments limited the ruler's power on land, the code created order on the sea. It offered clear protections for merchants and sailors, ensuring that disputes could be settled without violence or lengthy conflicts. By stabilizing commerce, the code strengthened the economic base that supported the crown's empire. It also encouraged the growth of international trade networks that connected the northeastern peninsula with Italy, North Africa, the islands of the Central Sea, and the shores of the Eastern Basin. This legal and political framework nurtured a rich cultural environment. The northeastern crown stood at a crossroads where different languages, customs, and artistic traditions converged. The inland valleys spoke one tongue touched by mountain life and older Iberian influences. The coastal counties spoke another, shaped by maritime contact and the rhythm of trade. As merchants traveled between Sicily, Naples, Sardinia, and Athens, they carried songs, stories, and artistic tastes with them. These influences did not remain confined to ports or courts. They spread through markets, churches, and urban neighborhoods. The fusion of cultures became one of the defining qualities of the crown. In literature, poets blended local forms with ideas drawn from Italian, Occitan, and Greek sources. Love poetry developed its own style, admired across Europe. Chronicles described events with a tone that balanced detail and reflection, shaped by the political habit of open debate. Scholars who traveled through the crown's territories encountered works from the Greek world, the Arabic-speaking lands, and the Latin West. These encounters broadened the intellectual space in which they worked. Architectural styles mixed as well. Mediterranean arches, Gothic structures, and local stonework appeared side by side in the cities. Wealthy merchants built houses that reflected the influence of Eastern designs they had seen during voyages. Churches displayed carvings and paintings inspired by both local traditions and foreign guests. Urban streets echoed with many languages, as sailors, traders, and officials passed through markets filled with goods from across the sea. Music, too, reflected this diversity. Instruments borrowed from Arabic traditions blended with northern string forms. Courtly songs carried traces of both local melodies and foreign rhythms. The wide reach of the crown allowed performers and composers to encounter styles they would never have known in a more closed society. These cultural exchanges strengthened a sense of identity built not on isolation but on connection. The presence of many cultures also shaped the daily habits of urban life. Spices, fabrics, and foods from distant markets became part of regular consumption. Merchants from different regions established communities in the ports, each bringing its own customs. Inns and taverns welcomed travelers who shared stories of lands as varied as the Greek mainland and the North African coast. The result was a society that recognized itself as part of a larger world. This openness helped the crown maintain its empire. Officials who traveled to administer faraway territories understood the value of local customs, because they had witnessed cultural diversity at home. They were more willing than many rivals to respect the rights of subject populations. They could communicate and negotiate with foreign elites through shared commercial and cultural practices. This flexibility became one of the crown's greatest strengths. The manuscripts that preserve the ideas of this era reflect this cultural richness. Chronicles recorded the deeds of rulers, merchants, and soldiers with detail and insight. Legal texts displayed a precision born from the needs of a trading society. Religious works blended local devotion with influences from Italy and beyond. Poetry expressed themes that crossed borders, blending the passion of the troubadours with the clarity of Mediterranean storytelling. These manuscripts formed a record not only of events, but of a way of life built on exchange. The influence of this cultural crossroads shaped the way the crown understood itself during its height. It saw the Mediterranean not as a barrier, but as a bridge. It viewed its distant territories not as foreign possessions, but as parts of a shared world. This broader perspective allowed it to adapt as new challenges arose. Even when rival powers threatened its holdings, the crown used its networks of trade, diplomacy, and culture to stabilize its position. As the region later merged with the inland kingdom, this cultural and political heritage continued to shape the new union. The inland traditions emphasized central authority and territorial consolidation. The coastal traditions emphasized negotiation, maritime law, and cultural openness. The joining of these traditions created a more complex system than either crown had known alone. The new union drew on the administrative habits formed through ruling Sicily, Naples, Sardinia, and Athens. It drew on the maritime experience that had governed fleets and trade routes for centuries. It drew on the vibrant culture that had flourished in ports shaped by many influences. Even as the inland kingdom gained more influence, the legacy of the northeastern crown remained part of the shared identity. The code that regulated maritime life continued to shape commerce. The political traditions that limited royal power influenced debates about governance. The cultural mixture that had grown through centuries of Mediterranean contact enriched the arts of the Union. Without this earlier foundation, the region's later achievements would have lacked the depth and experience that allowed it to thrive in distant oceans and foreign courts. The story of merchants, monarchs, and manuscripts therefore stands as a continuation of the rise that began with maritime expansion. It shows how the crown translated its political habits into stable governance, how it transformed scattered customs into a legal code that reached far beyond its borders, and how it created a cultural space in which ideas from many lands found a home. These threads connect directly with the earlier expansion from the Pyrenees and the rise of a network of islands and ports. Together they form a picture of a society that understood power not only through conquest, but through law, culture, and the exchange of ideas. The long history of the northeastern crown reached its height during the centuries when merchants shaped its ports, manuscripts preserved its laws, and monarchs balanced their authority with the obligations laid down by assemblies and charters. That period gave it a character that stood apart from the inland kingdom with which it would later join. Its people lived within a legal and cultural framework that protected local rights, celebrated maritime achievement, and encouraged exchange across the Mediterranean. Yet the forces that united the peninsula would slowly reshape these traditions until the older identity faded beneath a broader name. The last section ended with the influence of coastal laws, political checks, and cultural mixtures that survived even after the Union began. The next chapter follows how those traditions struggled to endure as new rulers, wars, and policies shifted the balance of power. The marriage between Isabel of Castile and Fernando of the northeastern crown marked the start of a new political bond. The Union did not immediately create a single country, and each kingdom kept its own laws, taxes, and institutions. Yet the shared rule introduced a new rhythm. Both rulers worked together on major decisions that affected the peninsula. Although the northeastern crown retained its assemblies and municipal freedoms, the inland kingdom had greater population, wealth, and influence. Over time, its voice dominated joint policies. Courts across Europe spoke of the rulers as a single power, even though their crowns remained distinct. This outside perception helped diminish the visibility of the older structures. Isabel came from a realm that had developed strong central authority. Fernando came from a realm defined by negotiation and limited royal power. Their partnership blended these traditions, but the inland approach shaped the new system more strongly. The inland court held greater influence in shaping the shared direction of the crown. As both rulers looked toward wider ambitions, including campaigns that involved the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, the inland court often became the preferred stage for major decisions. The northeastern institutions still operated, but they now operated in the shadow of a larger political machine. This subtle shift affected every layer of administration. The coastal ports continued to support trade, but new trade routes across the ocean began to draw attention away from the older maritime centers. Assemblies still met to approve taxes and affirm rights, but they were no longer the focal point of a separate identity. Fernando understood the importance of these political bodies, yet he also recognized that the long-term direction of the Union required a more unified approach. The inland kingdom had a tradition of speaking with a single voice. The northeastern crown had a tradition of speaking with many. These traditions existed side by side for several generations, but as the joint monarchy grew stronger, the balance continued to tilt. By the time the next generations inherited the throne, the memory of two distinct crowns became less vivid. The inland kingdom's institutions shaped the new court, guided most appointments, and influenced taxation across the peninsula. The older maritime identity remained strongest in cities along the northeastern coast and the islands, where guilds, merchants, and local councils held on to their privileges. But the court that directed wars, diplomacy, and colonial expansion increasingly viewed the peninsula as a single entity. In that vision, the older distinctions mattered less. This slow shift would have lasting consequences. When the new monarchy expanded across the Atlantic, it relied on the knowledge gained from centuries of Mediterranean trade, but the world attributed these achievements to the inland kingdom that stood at the center of the court. The coastal traditions became background elements rather than defining characteristics. The memory of the maritime empire that had reached Sicily, Naples, Sardinia, and Athens grew dimmer as later writers focused on transatlantic conquest and imperial administration. The fading of the older identity did not occur through a single event. It happened through gradual changes in court culture, legal reforms, and the slow rise of central authority. Yet one event would prove decisive. The War of the Spanish Succession reshaped the political map of the peninsula and marked the final moment when the northeastern crown's institutions still stood as a separate system. When the conflict began, a dispute over the throne ignited deeper rivalries between major European powers. Local elites in the northeastern region supported one claimant, while the inland court supported another. Their choice was shaped by political culture, economic concerns, and fears about losing local rights. When the war ended, the Allied forces supporting the northeastern claim collapsed. The new ruler, supported by France, took control of the peninsula and imposed sweeping reforms. These reforms eliminated the separate assemblies, charters, and legal traditions that had defined the northeastern crown for centuries. The new government abolished the political bodies that had limited royal power. Local privileges disappeared. The administrative structures that had grown from medieval traditions were replaced by a system closer to that of the inland kingdom. The northeastern lands now became provinces governed directly from the central court. The right to negotiate taxes vanished. The older maritime assemblies lost all authority. Towns that had once defended their charters with pride now fell under the same laws that applied across the broader monarchy. These changes ended the political independence that had allowed the northeastern crown to rule Sicily, Naples, Sardinia, and Athens. The war had not only decided the fate of the throne, it had ended the centuries-long existence of a separate political culture. The aftermath of the conflict sealed the fate of the manuscripts, laws, and customs that had shaped the northeastern identity. Some traditions survived in memory, in archival documents, and in the pride of local communities. But the new centralized administration encouraged a narrative that viewed the past through a single lens. The unified monarchy promoted a history that celebrated victories across the Atlantic, the rise of a colonial empire, and the power of the central court. In that story, the earlier achievements of the northeastern crown were mentioned only when they supported the larger image of unity. This process of erasure was not intentional in every case. It grew from the desire to present a strong, unified identity at a time when European rivals looked for weaknesses. The inland kingdom's traditions provided a straightforward story of consolidation and expansion. The northeastern crown's history was more complex. It involved negotiation, shared authority, and multiple centers of power. These qualities made for a rich political culture, but they did not fit neatly into a narrative centered on central strength. As the unified monarchy expanded abroad, it preferred stories that emphasized direct rule rather than assemblies that could limit the crown. The result was that the memory of the northeastern crown's immense contribution to Mediterranean trade, maritime law, and cultural exchange faded behind the achievements of the later empire. The earlier code that shaped maritime law across the sea became part of a distant past rather than a celebrated national foundation. The political habit of balancing royal authority with local rights disappeared beneath new laws that emphasized uniformity. The cultural mixture that defined the ports of the northeastern coast became a quiet influence rather than a recognized legacy. Yet the earlier contributions did not vanish completely. They remained woven into the legal traditions that governed maritime commerce. They appeared in the architecture of old cities, the rhythms of coastal speech, and the manuscripts that scholars continued to study. They lingered in the way local communities defended their identity and preserved their language. The story of the northeastern crown lived on, even if it no longer held a place of honor in the broader national narrative. The erasure of its independent identity reflected a larger trend that shaped many European regions during the early modern age. Central monarchies preferred uniform systems of law, taxation, and administration. They favored stories that supported the legitimacy of the new order. In this context, the older traditions of shared authority seemed cumbersome or outdated. The northeastern crown had built an empire through negotiation and respect for local privileges, but the new monarchy valued speed, clarity, and central command. The past that did not support this vision became less visible in official accounts. Even so, the memory of the northeastern crown continued to inspire later generations who looked back at the peninsula's history. Scholars rediscovered the legal innovations of the Book of the Sea Consulate. Historians studied the expansion that once reached Athens. Writers explored the cultural exchanges that shaped the ports and courts of the Mediterranean. These studies revealed that the region had once been a crossroads of ideas, rather than merely a province of a larger empire. The legacy of the northeastern crown also shaped modern debates about identity. Communities that traced their origins to the medieval charters and assemblies continued to take pride in their traditions. They pointed to the centuries when their ancestors participated in political life and helped shape laws that influenced faraway lands. This heritage became a reminder that the peninsula's unity was built on the foundations of multiple cultures, not just one. The fading crown, therefore, represents a story of transformation rather than disappearance. Its political structure was dismantled after the War of the Spanish Succession, but its contributions to maritime law, cultural exchange, and political thought continued to influence the region in subtle ways. The manuscripts that survived preserved the voices of merchants, jurists, and chroniclers who described a world where negotiation shaped power and where law guided trade across the sea. The cultural mixture that once flourished in ports remained part of the region's identity, even when overshadowed by the larger narrative of empire. Connecting this final chapter with all that came before reveals a continuous thread. The northeastern crown built its early strength through maritime expansion. It shaped its political character through assemblies and charters. It enriched Mediterranean commerce through its legal innovations. It blended cultures through centuries of trade, conquest, and contact. When the union with the inland kingdom began, these traditions helped shape the wider monarchy. When the central court later absorbed the older structures, those traditions continued quietly in the background. The history of the fading crown is a reminder that political unity often hides the complexity of earlier epochs. Behind every unified state lies a tapestry of older kingdoms, each with its own laws, customs, and achievements. The northeastern crown story shows how a vibrant political and cultural world can be overshadowed by later events, even while its influence endures. It also shows how the memory of such a world can survive through manuscripts, customs, and scholarship long after its institutions have been dismantled. To understand the region's identity fully, it is necessary to look beyond the later empire and recognize the earlier kingdom that shaped so much of the Mediterranean. Its decline after the War of the Spanish Succession marked the end of a political tradition that had lasted for centuries, but its legacy remains present in the legal, cultural, and historical fabric of the region. The fading of its crown did not erase the achievements of its merchants, its lawmakers, or its scholars. It only changed the way the world remembered them. The memory of the northeastern crown faded under the weight of later politics, yet its imprint never disappeared. The last section followed how the old institutions dissolved after the War of the Spanish Succession, and how the narrative of a larger monarchy minimized the achievements of the earlier maritime world. That story sets the stage for the present, because the legacy of that lost empire continues to echo across the peninsula. It lives in the languages spoken in its former territories, in the layout of its cities, and in the identities of the people who still cherish their link to a past that predates the rise of a single unified state. To understand how powerful these echoes remain, one must look not only at documents and chronicles, but at the daily lives of communities that still draw meaning from an era when the northeastern crown shaped the Mediterranean. Modern regions that once formed the heart of that crown carry forward many signs of the older world. Catalonia and Valencia, in particular, evolved under the influence of the political structures, laws, and customs that made the medieval crown distinct. Today, these regions maintain strong identities rooted in their local languages, their institutions, and their shared history. When visitors see the flags, hear the local speech, or attend festivals, they witness traditions that developed when merchants, sailors, and lawmakers shaped life under a system built on negotiation rather than imposed authority. The pride shown in these customs reflects a continued attachment to the memory of a kingdom that once ruled distant islands and ports. In Catalonia, the local language remains one of the most visible signs of this heritage. It is spoken in schools, homes, markets, and public events. It survived the disappearance of medieval assemblies, the rise of centralized rule, and later periods of suppression. It carries within it the rhythm of poems, legal codes, and merchant records that date back to the era when the northeastern crown governed its Mediterranean territories. The survival of the language speaks to the strength of cultural continuity. It also reveals how communities protect their identity even when political structures fall away. Valencia shows a similar, yet distinct connection to the past. The local language shares deep roots with the one spoken in Catalonia, yet it developed its own character shaped by local agriculture, maritime trade, and cultural blending. The fertile lands around Valencia supported a rich rural life, while the coastal ports connected the region to faraway markets. These influences helped shape a culture that blended older Iberian traditions with the customs of merchants, sailors, and artisans who traveled under the banner of the northeastern crown. Today, regional celebrations, food, and everyday speech reflect this layered heritage. Modern identity in both regions draws on a sense of historical continuity. The memory of lost charters and assemblies fuels discussions about autonomy and governance. Though centuries have passed since the crown's institutions fell, the values they embodied still matter. Communities recall that they once took part in councils where laws were debated and rights defended. This memory shapes modern discussions about self-rule, local rights, and cultural protection. Even when these debates spark contention, they remind the wider country that the peninsula was once a tapestry of kingdoms rather than a single unified bloc. Visitors who walk through the old streets of Barcelona or Valencia discover evidence of this heritage in the stones beneath their feet. Gothic arches, fortified towers, and old merchant halls survive as reminders of the era when the northeastern crown controlled maritime trade routes across the sea. Each building tells a story of guilds that regulated commerce, courts that settled disputes, and rulers who governed through agreements with local elites. These structures carry more than architectural beauty. They reflect a political culture grounded in representation and negotiation. In Barcelona, the old Maritime Hall stands as one of the most impressive examples of this past. Its wide vaults and tall columns testify to the wealth generated by Mediterranean trade. Merchants once gathered there to discuss contracts, freight rates, and the laws that governed ships and cargo. These discussions shaped the maritime code that influenced trade across the Mediterranean. Though the modern city has expanded far beyond its medieval heart, the hall remains a vivid link to a time when the northeastern crown's fleet ruled distant waters. Valencia also displays many traces of this world. The old Silk Exchange Hall shows the economic power the city once held. Its twisting columns and high ceilings reflect the prosperity that resulted from intense trade networks. Though the architecture speaks of wealth, it also speaks of shared governance. Merchants who traded in silk, ceramics, agricultural goods, and other products worked under systems that protected their rights and regulated commerce. These systems emerged from the political culture of the northeastern crown, which combined local autonomy with regional coordination. The islands that once formed part of the crown also preserve visible signs of its past. In Majorca, the layout of the capital's old quarter reflects centuries of maritime influence. In Sardinia, coastal fortresses and noble houses reveal the presence of Catalan and Aragonese administrators who governed the island for generations. Though later rulers modified many structures, the core remains tied to the medieval crown. Street names, architectural styles, and preserved documents reflect a long interaction between the islanders and the merchants, soldiers, and officials who traveled under the crown's banner. Language also serves as a living artifact. In many coastal towns, variants of the old language still echo in speech. These forms evolved across centuries, but retain links to the speech used in the medieval courts, markets, and ports. This continuity shows how deeply rooted the northern Mediterranean influence remains. The survival of these languages is a testament to the strength of local identity and to the resilience of cultural memory. Even when laws, dynasties, and borders changed, people kept speaking the language of their ancestors. Architecture and language together paint a picture of a past that never fully disappeared. They reveal how the old crown shaped the identity of communities across the northeastern peninsula and the islands. These traces contradict the idea that the peninsula's history can be told through the story of a single kingdom. Instead, they show that the land's past is a mosaic of cultures, each leaving its own imprint. The northeastern crown was one of the most influential of these cultures, yet it remains one of the least recognized in popular histories. Travelers who explore the region's towns and cities often notice details that connect directly to the medieval past. Narrow streets follow routes laid down when merchants needed access to ports. Market squares reflect the social life of communities that gathered under local charters. City walls recall the defense of Mediterranean possessions. Churches and palaces display symbols that once represented the crown. These elements combine to create a sense of continuity that stretches back many centuries. Even rural areas preserve this memory. Farmhouses, irrigation systems, and agricultural terraces reflect techniques and customs introduced or regulated under the old crown. The blending of local and imported traditions produced a landscape shaped by both the land and the sea. Farmers grew crops that merchants exported across the Mediterranean. Villages lived by calendars that combined agricultural cycles with religious festivals introduced during the crown's expansion. Though many modern inhabitants may not know the full history behind these customs, their continued practice reflects a deep and unbroken link to the past. The influence of the old crown also appears in legal traditions. Modern commercial law in the region contains traces of the maritime code developed during the medieval period. Even though central authorities later replaced many local laws, the principles of fair dealing, contract clarity, and merchant protection that shaped earlier codes still echo through modern regulations. Scholars who compare medieval and modern law note similarities that reveal a lasting influence. This legal memory connects present commerce to centuries of Mediterranean trade shaped by the northeastern crown's principles. Cultural festivals often provide the most vivid reminders of this heritage. In both Catalonia and Valencia, celebrations mark historical events linked to the medieval crown. Parades reenact battles or honor patron saints introduced during the period of expansion. Music, dance, and costume reflect the blending of local, Mediterranean, and even Near Eastern influences that characterize the old empire. When communities gather to celebrate these festivals, they keep alive the memory of the merchants, sailors, and artisans who shaped their ancestors' world. These echoes carry a message that extends beyond regional identity. They remind the wider peninsula of the depth and variety of its past. The peninsula did not emerge from a single source. It emerged from the union, tension, and interaction of several distinct kingdoms, each with its own traditions. The northeastern crown was one of the most outward-looking of these kingdoms. Its maritime empire stretched far across the sea. Its political system balanced authority and representation. Its cultural life blended influences from across the region. Forgetting this past narrows the story of the peninsula's development. The broader national narrative often focuses on later imperial achievements. It emphasizes the conquest of American lands, the rise of a global empire, and the power of the central court. While these achievements are important, they form only part of the story. The earlier world of Mediterranean expansion laid foundations for navigation, trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Recognition of this heritage enriches the understanding of how the peninsula came to play such a large role in world history. Re-examining the legacy of the northeastern crown also clarifies the origins of regional identities that remain strong today. The pride shown in local language, architecture, and tradition becomes clearer when placed within the context of a long history of shared governance and cultural flourishing. These identities do not arise from recent political developments. They arise from centuries of distinct historical experience. Understanding this background helps explain why many communities feel a strong connection to their past. Moreover, acknowledging the complexity of the peninsula's history encourages a more balanced view of its present. Rather than seeing regional identities as anomalies, one can view them as expressions of the peninsula's diverse origins. The northeastern crown represents one strand of this diversity. Its influence continues to shape the way people understand themselves, their communities, and their relationship to the wider country. When this heritage is recognized, modern debates gain depth and historical grounding. There is also value in seeing how the memory of the medieval crown contributes to a shared cultural wealth. The architecture from the era enriches tourism, inspires artists, and provides a sense of continuity. The language connects people across regions and fosters cultural exchange. The festivals strengthen community bonds. The manuscripts and legal traditions offer insight into the development of European governance. All these elements add to the cultural richness of the peninsula. As interest in medieval history grows, more people begin to revisit the achievements of the old crown. Museums display artifacts from the period. Universities hold conferences on maritime law and Mediterranean expansion. Local councils promote preservation of historical sites. Through these efforts, the legacy of the Crown slowly gains greater recognition. This recognition does not aim to elevate one region above others. Rather, it seeks to restore a missing part of the collective memory. The persistence of these echoes teaches an important lesson about history. Even when political structures fall, the cultural and social patterns they shaped can endure for centuries. The Northeastern Crown may no longer exist, but its influence lives on through language, architecture, custom, and identity. This endurance shows that history cannot be reduced to the rise and fall of governments. It is carried forward by people, communities, and traditions. The story of the Old Crown also offers a reminder about the importance of remembering forgotten empires. When the past is viewed through a narrow lens, much is lost. The peninsula's history becomes richer when one acknowledges the kingdoms that once shaped it. The Northeastern Crown stands among the most remarkable of these kingdoms. Its reach across the Mediterranean, its balance between royal authority and local rights, and its blend of cultures make it a significant chapter in European history. Recognizing this heritage deepens the understanding of the peninsula's development. It reveals how earlier institutions influenced later political thought. It shows how maritime experience shaped global expansion. It highlights the diversity of the cultures that formed the modern state. It also offers a more complete picture of how regional identities persist. These insights arise only when the full breadth of history is considered. The Old Crown may no longer rule islands or influence sea routes, but its memory enriches the places that once formed its heart. Catalonia and Valencia remain proud of their languages and traditions. Their cities preserve architectural treasures that link the present to the medieval past. Their people carry forward customs that reflect a long and complex history. When these elements are recognized, the story of the peninsula becomes more vivid and more complete. The true breadth of the peninsula's past extends far beyond the achievements of a single empire. It includes realms that rose and fell, cultures that blended and transformed, and traditions that survived despite great change. Among these, the legacy of the Northeastern Crown stands as a powerful reminder that the peninsula's story is both deep and diverse. Remembering this legacy does not diminish the later empire. It enriches the understanding of how the region became what it is today.